It's not personal, Diana. Mitchell just fits the future better. That's what my father said. After 17 years of me keeping the company afloat, pulling double shifts, even mortgaging my home to cover payroll during a bad quarter. They didn't even fire me in person. Just a voicemail. No name, no thank you. Only silence and a legal handoff. So I stayed silent too. But unlike them, my silence came with records. And by the time they realized what I'd done, it was too late to unring the bell. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever given everything to a family that erased you anyway? If yes, leave a comment number 1. If not, count that as a quiet kind of blessing. Drop a number 0. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away and mean it. They didn't even say my name, just effective immediately. It played like a line from a movie, the kind with sterile lighting and no soundtrack. But this was real, and it was my kitchen. The ceramic mug in my hand had long gone cold, though the cranberry-scented candle, flickering on the counter, still gave off some warmth. Thanksgiving had passed 3 days ago, but a napkin with a stitched turkey still sat folded near the sink, as if I hadn't found the heart to throw it out yet. I replayed the voicemail, once, then again, then slower. My mother's voice didn't waver, didn't sigh. It was clinical, curt. Hi, we've made a decision. We're restructuring Kellerman and Company. Effective immediately. You're no longer part of the business. You'll be hearing from our attorney. A pause. Then the soft exhale I knew belonged to my father. It was the most emotion the message contained. No mention of me by name. Not Diana. Not even you in any real way. I was a footnote, an omission. Just 2 years ago, at a company dinner, my mother had told one of the partners' wives, "Diana keeps the lights on." I'd smiled quietly into my glass of wine. But I guess they'd grown fond of the dark. Outside, Bend wore its winter like a quiet habit. Low clouds pressed down on the rooftops. Lights twinkled across the street. Mrs. Morgan already had her reindeer out, though it wasn't even December yet. The glow filtered through my window, giving the illusion of warmth. Inside, it was just me, the hum of the fridge, and a hollow in my chest that hadn't yet found a name. I didn't cry. There was nothing left to cry over. I'd seen the signs for months. The updated org chart that didn't list me. The board emails I was suddenly no longer copied on. The finance strategy meetings rescheduled without notice. But still, no conversation, no thank you. Just a Sunday morning voicemail. I took another sip of my coffee, purely out of habit. It was tepid, bitter. The mug still bore the old company logo, Kellerman and Company. Establishment 1967, and a tiny chip on the rim. I ran my finger along the flaw. My grandfather had started the business with one welder and a borrowed pickup truck. He used to say, "Build clean, build steady, build quiet." I'd lived by that. And now they'd cleaned me out, steadily, quietly. I stood and walked to the counter, where my laptop sat closed, beside a stack of unopened mail and a half-finished shopping list for holiday groceries I no longer felt like buying. I opened the computer, the screen flashing briefly before settling into the desktop photo of Crater Lake, taken 5 years ago during the only vacation I'd allowed myself in over a decade. No new emails. I scrolled to the folder labeled Legal and found a thread from 2 years ago, Marcia Dwyer. I'd met her at a finance compliance seminar in Phoenix. We'd exchanged small talk over hotel coffee, the kind served in paper cups too hot to hold. She specialized in corporate transition law, specifically family-owned businesses. At the time, I'd filed her contact under Maybe. Now felt like Maybe. I clicked Compose, and stared at the blank message for a moment. The cursor blinked patiently. I didn't feel angry. I felt precise, focused. There was no room for emotion, not right now. Marcia, it's time. Let's talk about options regarding my 40% stake in Kellerman and Company. I'd prefer discretion and a clean approach. Let me know if you have a good time. Diana Kellerman. I read it once. No edits, no backstory, no apology for the timing. Then I hit send. The sound it made, just a soft click, didn't match the weight it carried. I exhaled. It wasn't a long breath, just one I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I closed the tab and leaned back in my chair, staring at the steam that still hovered over my untouched mug. I closed the laptop and just sat there, watching the steam rise from my untouched mug. I didn't disappear. They just stopped looking where I stood. It started slowly, so subtly, that I didn't realize what was happening until it was already done. The kind of quiet subtraction that doesn't call attention to itself. Just an unchecked box here, a you're not needed there. But looking back, the pattern is unmistakable. I was 21 the first time I stepped onto the factory floor. My heels were too clean. My blazer is too stiff. A foreman named Hal chuckled and said I looked lost. Maybe I was. But I stayed. Procurement first, then vendor management, then payroll. I took night classes in finance and logistics. I wasn't just trying to be useful, I was trying to belong. Not because they asked me to, but because it felt like I was supposed to. When my grandfather passed, it should have been obvious who'd carry the business forward. Mitchell was in Austin pitching app ideas. I was writing quarterly reports. But somehow, the legacy floated his way. I kept showing up anyway. The year 2 of our major clients defaulted. We nearly missed payroll. I didn't ask. I didn't tell. I pulled a second mortgage on my house and funneled the funds through a shell LLC. In the quarterly report, I labeled it Stabilization Liquidity. When we recovered the next quarter, I overheard my father on the phone with a board member. Mitchell made a smart call on that invoice structure, he said. Mitchell, who hadn't logged into QuickBooks in half a year. I didn't correct him. That same year, we introduced a new org chart. I wasn't on it. It's just a visual, my mother said, brushing it off. Don't overthink it. She smiled when she said it. Not cold, not cruel, just soft enough to make me question my reaction. So I stayed quiet. Again. Now, seated in my home office, I watched light snow dust the pine outside. The peppermint tea in my hand was more of a habit than a comfort. I'd pulled out the old binders, the ones no one thought to wipe clean when they pushed me out. My olive green wool coat hung by the door, shoulders slightly frayed from winters past. Grandpa gave it to me when I got promoted to finance director. Wear it like you mean it, he said. I did, still do. I flipped open a file labeled Operations. The familiar tabs poked out like old friends. There were vendor contacts, audit trails, invoices, pages I'd printed, color-coded, filed over years. I stopped when I found the company photo, the one from the reception wall. My headshot, the same one that used to be framed by the elevator. Now bent, printed in dull grayscale, slipped between an outdated vendor list and a half-torn memo. Before that, there were hints. Internal emails I wasn't copied on, strategy decks I never saw. My logins were revoked, one at a time, no announcements, just doors that quietly stopped opening. I thought of last year's Thanksgiving. I brought my homemade pecan pie, the one Mom used to request. When I arrived, she gave me a quick hug and said, "Mitchell's bringing the real dessert." She laughed. I smiled. Then I set the pie down on the corner of the counter, where it sat untouched all night. That was the thing about being me. I was visible only when I fixed something, when I made problems disappear, but never when things worked. Digging deeper in the binder, I found what I didn't know I was looking for: a copy of the restructuring document, legal draft, watermark, initials. At the bottom, next to "Initiated by," was her name: Carolyn Kellerman, President, Mother. That's when it clicked, not like a slap, but like a drawer quietly shutting behind me. They didn't forget me. They erased me. Have you ever been quietly removed from something you helped build by the very people who once said they couldn't do it without you? If you felt that sting of being needed but never seen, leave a comment, number 8. Now let's see what happened next in this story. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there with the page in my lap and a peppermint-scented room pressing in like a memory. In the distance, a neighbor's wind chime rattled softly in the cold. A sound so familiar, it almost comforted me. In a folder marked Operations, I find my headshot, once framed in the office, now bent, printed in grayscale, tossed between outdated vendor lists. I wasn't angry. I was accurate. That distinction mattered more than anyone might think. Anger clouds. Accuracy cuts. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the math to balance. If they could reduce me to a footnote, I could reduce my role to a transaction. Clean, legal, no mess, just numbers. The rain hadn't stopped since morning. It made the house feel smaller, the windows dimmer. I'd only turned on one lamp in the corner of my home office, enough to read the tabs on the binders now spread across the floor. The olive coat still hung by the door, sleeves damp from when I'd stepped outside to retrieve the morning paper and barely noticed the chill. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head. When the tide turns, don't yell. Just know where your boat is tied. I was tied to data, to facts, and I knew every knot by heart. I started with the PDFS, 5 years of payroll projections, then the QuickBooks exports, vendor logs, loan application backups, a folder labeled Client Defaults, 2018 to 2021. Color-coded stickers I'd long forgotten I ever used. My handwriting was smaller back then. Somewhere between the spreadsheets, I paused and remembered Henry. He'd worked in warehouse logistics. Friendly, always early. One night in 2016, the shelving unit collapsed and pinned his leg. HR called it an unfortunate oversight. The company offered a vague settlement. I quietly visited him in the hospital, brought the full report with supporting documentation, and told him to consult an attorney. I even helped his wife draft the first letter. No one at the office ever brought it up again. Neither did I, until now. Marcia agreed to meet at a quiet cafe just off the main square. It wasn't the sort of place where people wore name tags or had branded mugs. Just chip tables, laminated menus, and $1 coffee refills. I arrived early, ordered tea. The peppermint burned a little, but I liked that it did. Marcia was exactly as I remembered. Pressed blazer, warm smile that didn't overdo itself, and a voice that skipped small talk when you didn't need it. We shook hands like we were in a courtroom, not a booth beside a vintage jukebox. I reviewed your message, she said, laying out a single folder. Your ownership stake is clear. 40%. No right of first refusal in the operating agreement. You can sell without a board vote. I nodded. Quietly. Quiet diligence, she repeated. No alerts. We'll position this as a transitional handoff. The bell over the cafe door jingled behind her. A man stepped in, shook the water from his coat, and glanced around before locking eyes with me. Ms. Kellerman? He asked. His voice had a trace of surprise. It took me a second. Then I saw it. Henry. A few more years in his face, a small scar above his brow, but still him. He smiled, pulled up a chair. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "Marcia didn't tell me." I looked at her. She only shrugged. "He's on my diligence team now." "I owe you," he said quietly. "You probably don't remember." "I remember." He reached into his bag and pulled out a thumb drive. "Some internal logs from the old reporting servers. I thought they might help clarify the timelines." The gesture didn't come with a speech, just the sound of rain on the window and the soft clink of a coffee cup on the table. We didn't linger. I finished my tea, left cash with a generous tip, and nodded at the waitress, who had barely glanced our way. No one knew who I was, and I liked it that way. That evening, I returned home and spread everything across my office floor. I pulled out a new binder, black faux leather, and started organizing by year. 2015, 2016, 2017, payroll rescues, deferred payments, the Shell LLC documents. I included the vendor notes Henry brought. The sections started to fill, tabs lining up like old bones being set in place. I closed the last ring of the binder and exhaled. Slow, clean, final. I close the binder, run my finger down the spine, and whisper, "Let's begin." When silence breaks, it doesn't come with thunder. It comes with paper trails and panic. The first missed call came at 6:12 a.m. I let it ring. The second, I silenced. By the time I pulled into the lot behind Maple and Rust, there were 13 more. Mitchell wasn't subtle, and panic made him loud. But I'd already set the volume low, and I wasn't in the mood for drama with my coffee. Inside, the bell above the door chimed softly, one of those old brass ones that rattled more than it rang. The place was warm in the way only a small-town diner could be, with fogged-up windows and the smell of bacon that never quite left the booths. Holiday lights blinked unevenly over the register. A half-decorated tree leaned against the far wall. It looked like someone gave up halfway through the garland. "Morning, Miss Kellerman," June said from behind the counter, already reaching for the chipped mug she knew I liked. "Half decaf and a blueberry muffin, right?" I nodded. "Thanks, June." She slid the mug in front of me with a practiced hand. The coffee was lukewarm, just the way I preferred it when I had time to sit. I pulled out the local paper someone had folded and left at the end of the counter. The headline was about a zoning debate, nothing urgent. I liked it that way. My phone buzzed again. I flipped it over, face down. The voicemail from earlier still sat unplayed. I tapped it and listened. "Diana!" Mitchell sounded breathless. "You need to call me back, please. Something's happening. They're asking about Texas and the vendor contracts. It's getting bad. I don't know what you did, but you have to fix it. Please." I finished my coffee before I pressed play on the second message. More of the same. Fast, half-coherent, laced with phrases like frozen access, audit review, and "we need you." I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. Mitchell had always been good at appearances. Strategy. Vision, they called it. I'd always been the one balancing the numbers underneath those visions. I stirred sugar into my second cup, just as Marcia's name flashed on my screen. "They've begun," she said without preamble. Our teams flagged inconsistencies, primarily in Mitchell's Texas project. Funds labeled strategic reinvestment that don't match the asset schedules, marketing payments to a vendor with no business registration, and Carolyn's restructuring memos, thinly documented. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Any pushback?" "Not yet, but the board's outside counsel just requested a full timeline of all legacy finance protocols from the last 5 years. They'll see Henry's backups. They already have. He's cross-checking logs now. Your documentation is meticulous. The discrepancies are theirs. I thanked her and ended the call. No need for flourish. A message blinked in. Henry! Pulling 2018 vendor files. Do you remember what the justification was for the duplicate payments to Blue Horizon Media? They said it was a pilot campaign, but the metrics were never reported. Check Q2 notes. Got it. Found your original summary. Thanks. I let the phone rest on the table and reached for the muffin. I broke it in half but didn't eat. Instead, I looked out the window. The street was quiet, but I could sense the storm inside that building I used to run. Let them panic. Let them flip through files, trying to stitch a clean narrative from the scraps they'd left behind. An email arrived from my mother. Subject: quick conversation, body. Can we talk? No lawyers. I deleted it. The phone rang again. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the voice before he said a word. Diana, please. Mitchell. They're going line by line. Everything's falling apart. You have to tell them. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. I said nothing. Just say you were consulted. Say we worked together on this. It'll calm things down. Please. I closed my eyes, held the phone between my shoulder and cheek, and took a sip of my coffee. Then, finally, I spoke. You told me I was out. So I stayed out. Have you ever stayed silent? Not because you were weak, but because you finally realized your worth? If you've ever had to walk away from a place you once called home, leave a comment, number 9. Now, let's see how I carry forward from here. He didn't answer. Not right away. Just a shaky breath. Outside, the wind picked up. A few flakes of snow drifted past the window and caught in the branches of a bare tree near the curb. Outside the diner, snow begins to fall. I wrap my scarf tighter and leave without finishing my muffin. Closure doesn't always sound like a slammed door. Sometimes it's the quiet click of a drawer shutting. The snow was light that morning, just enough to dust the porch railing like powdered sugar on a forgotten scone. I sat curled beneath the old wool blanket I kept draped over the porch swing, my mug of mint tea warm against my palms. The bell tower down near the Methodist church rang 9 slow chimes, each one hanging in the air longer than the last. I didn't rush to meet the hour. I had nowhere to be. Marcia's call came just as I finished writing a line in my journal I didn't intend to share. Some exits are really entries. You just haven't seen the door yet. Congratulations, she said. Transfer complete. Clean. Quiet. No questions raised. I let the words settle. It didn't feel like winning. Just like breathing. Thank you. There's more, she added. The audit team flagged additional misreporting in Q3 last year. I'll forward you a copy for reference, but no action is required. Your name's nowhere in it. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Keep me off the thread. Will do. We ended the call. I set the phone down, face down, and let my tea steam against the cold air. Across the street, Mr. Keegan was salting his driveway in flannel pajamas and a parka. The smell of wood smoke drifted from someone's chimney, mixing with the sharpness of peppermint and snow. An envelope sat beside me on the swing, delivered just an hour earlier. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's. Inside, a photo frame wrapped in thin brown paper and taped neatly at the corners. I didn't need to unwrap it fully to know what it was. I peeled back the paper slowly. It was the same company photo that used to hang by the front desk. Me, Mitchell, Carolyn, and Dad, standing in front of the original factory building like we'd built it with our bare hands, smiling like we were a unit. But this one had a crack in the glass. a hairline fracture right across my face. Not broken, just interrupted. I stared at it for a while. Not with sadness. More like I was studying something I used to believe in. The sound of shoes on wooden steps pulled me out of the memory. "Hey, Ms. Kellerman," came a voice I hadn't heard in person for years. It was Henry, bundled in a navy coat, cheeks pink from the cold. He held something small in his hand. I was nearby, thought I'd stop by. He offered me a sheepish smile. "Hope that's okay?" "Of course," I said, sliding over on the swing to make space. He sat, but only for a moment, just long enough to hand me a small paper-wrapped object. Inside was a keychain, simple, made from worn brass, and stamped with the letters for D. The edges were smooth, like it had been held often. "The maintenance crew made it," he said. "Back in 11. You helped keep us from getting cut when the layoffs were looming. You probably don't even remember." "I remember," I said quietly. "They thought you saved their jobs that winter. They were right. They wanted you to have this." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just held the keychain in my hand, turning it over, feeling the cool weight of it settle in my palm. Henry didn't linger. He stood, nodded once, and left with a smile as soft as the snow still falling. I watched him walk down the steps, his boots making clean prints across the white dusting on my walkway. When he disappeared around the corner, I got up and walked inside. The house was still and warm. I pulled open the drawer in the hallway console, the one I'd been avoiding. I placed the photo frame inside, followed by the keychain, gently, like laying something to rest. Then I closed the drawer. Not with force, no snap, just a quiet, deliberate click. "I didn't walk away from them," I said aloud. "They walked past me." My phone buzzes again. I didn't check. Instead, I open the window slightly and breathe in the cold air. Some legacies are carried in silence. Some are rebuilt in peace. The diner was half full, humming with the soft warmth of December conversation. Overhead, a Bing Crosby song played low and steady, its scratchy charm blending with the clink of forks and the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. Outside, the snow fell just fast enough to blur the outlines of the lampposts, softening everything in a way I'd come to appreciate. I was in my usual booth by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of decaf, the scent of cinnamon and burnt sugar from a nearby slice of pecan pie curling up into the air. Across the room, a small fake tree blinked cheerfully beside the pie case. Next to it, pinned on the bulletin board with a red thumbtack, was a flyer that caught my eye. Community fundraiser. Help our own support for local factory families affected by the Kellerman restructuring. The words didn't sting, not anymore. I'd heard them enough. Said in whispers, in sympathy, in critique. But they weren't mine to carry anymore. That weight was off my shoulders. I reached into my bag, pulled out a plain envelope, and slid it into my lap. No return address, no note inside. Just a check and a quiet intention. On the front, I wrote in neat script. For them. I waited until June, the waitress, turned her back to refill someone's coffee before I stood, walked to the counter, and tucked the envelope just beneath the flyer. It tilted a little, uneven. I left it that way. Back at my booth, the pie had cooled, but I took another bite. Sweet, slightly too much nutmeg, just the way I remembered from childhood Thanksgivings, the kind where my grandfather would light the fireplace hours too early and insist on hand-churned whipped cream. I hadn't thought about those days in years. Funny what a slice of pie and a song on a jukebox could unearth. I opened my journal, flipping past pages of ink smudges and margin thoughts until I reached a blank space near the back. With slow strokes, I wrote, "Some truths you live. Some truths you let speak for themselves." Then, almost as an afterthought, I added, "Silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's strength choosing its moment." June approached with a fresh carafe. "Refill, Miss Kellerman?" I smiled. "Just a splash." As she poured, she nodded toward the window. "You've got good timing. Storm's supposed to pick up later tonight." I looked outside. The snow had thickened, falling in steady, silent sheets. The kind of snow that muffled the world. The kind you could stand in and hear your own breath. "Merry Christmas," she said with a wink. "Come by any time." "Merry Christmas, June." She moved on to the next booth, topping off an older couple's mugs. The man wore a tweed cap, the woman a holiday brooch shaped like a poinsettia. They shared a quiet conversation I couldn't hear, but their closeness felt familiar, like something once lost, now gently remembered. I gathered my things slowly, folded my journal, buttoned my coat, pulled my scarf tight around my neck. The keychain Henry had given me was in my coat pocket, its shape familiar now against my palm. Before leaving, I slipped a 20 under the saucer. It was more than the bill, but not more than the warmth deserved. That was the thing I'd learned lately. Sometimes generosity isn't about making a statement. It's about balance, quiet corrections, small repairs. As I stepped outside, the cold met me gently. It wasn't sharp or punishing, just honest. The lights along Main Street twinkled softly, reflected in puddles and slush. I paused on the sidewalk, breathing in the scent of pine and distant chimney smoke. The wind shifts. I pull my scarf higher and say aloud, "Still standing." Some endings don't arrive with doors slamming shut. They come softly, like snow on old rooftops, or a check left without a name. That morning at the diner, I didn't feel victorious. I felt still. And for the first time in a long while, stillness didn't mean being stuck. It meant peace. We often think of kindness as something we give away, but sometimes it's what quietly returns to us when we least expect it. Like a bench placed in the cold by someone who never expected company, gentle compassion always leaves room for others to rest beside it. If this story brought someone to mind, a sibling, a friend, or even a stranger you once helped, perhaps reach out. You never know when a quiet act of love might be the only warmth someone has left. And if this story stayed with you, even just a little, consider subscribing, so I can keep sharing stories that remind us what truly matters.